evening. Thanks for coming. I'm Kathy Beaudoin. So this is a really broad overview. There's so much to the history of the Cacciucco mills that you can't get it all in a slideshow. So if you have any comments or questions at the end, we'd be happy to take them. So I'm going to try my little pointer here and see if that clicks down. Yay, it worked. So if you picture this area more than 200 years ago, this is not Dover, but this is what I assume that Dover probably looked like. Factories were unknown. Dover was populated with about 2,000 people. It was an active trading port with a riverfront and known as the Landing, even in the 1700s. Farming, mercantile hubs. There were East and West India goods shops around to buy your consumer goods. We traded masts. We had sawmills. And we brought in lots of rum from Barbados. That's why we have Barbados Pond. So this is a man, John Williams, who is the founder of the mills here in Dover. And he came to Dover from Alfred, Maine in 1807. He had a dry goods store on Main Street. He became very wealthy. He was known as quite a talker and quite an enthusiastic person who could talk people into donating money. So the quote of the day from that time was, he had a mobile and whimsical mouth. I guess today he'd be a politician. He formed Dover's first Board of Trade, and he formed a club called the Fish and Potato Club. And he started talking about factories as early as 1811. There were no factories in New England at that time. But he had observed down at the bridge on Central Avenue, one of his friends hand-produced yarn spinning business. Jeremiah Stickney was producing yarn out of raw cotton. And he was using water power to do it, but it was all hand done, no machinery. And that got John Williams thinking about, what about if I got some machinery? And we actually started to produce cloth in Dover. So the club met, the Fish and Potato Club, met just up here on Silver Street at the Dame Tibbetts Tavern. And there were two principals, John Williams and Isaac Wendell. There were nine other investors. And they pooled their money, and they came up with $50,000 in capital stock. They founded on December 15th, 1812, the Dover Cotton Factory in this house, which is still there. You can see it as you drive up Silver Street. And they had their first organizational meeting just after the holidays on January 19th, 1813. Now, Dover had very advantageous conditions to host a factory. We had water power at different falls throughout the city, a humid atmosphere, particularly in the summer and fall. We had pure water in the streams for bleaching. We had a close proximity to the sea. We already had a great shipping industry in and out of our port. We had an ample population, 2,000 was quite large at the time, and good transportation systems in place. Unfortunately, they really wanted to build at the First Falls, which is right on our Central Avenue Bridge where the mills are now, but that was owned by somebody else, Daniel Waldron at the time. So he wouldn't sell. So on April 25th, 1814, Williams and Wendell purchased 5 acres in North Dover at Kimball's Falls, 3 miles from downtown. And here they built their first factory and constructed this dam. And this is right where Liberty Mutual is today. And I'm told, although I've never done it, that you can walk down to the water from Liberty Mutual and still find pieces of foundation of the old Mill Number 1. They built a 3-story wooden building, 100 feet by 32 feet, and then a little L that was 20 feet by 30 feet, and the log dam to control the flow of the water, because they had to do it with water power. In 1815, that mill was completed, and they started making just cotton yarn. We didn't want to jump into things with both feet, so let's see if we can just import some raw cotton, bring it up to the factory, and turn it into yarn. John Williams' nephew, whose name was Moses Paul, became the superintendent in charge of this factory. In 1816, they imported some real machinery from England, and they first produced cloth in 1816 in Dover. This was only the second factory to get up to speed in New England at this time. They had 175 looms inside that building. And the girls, because it was the girls who worked at the looms, the men were the bosses and the overseers, and the girls were the workers. They tended 2 looms each. The work was monotonous but not strenuous. They had good pay. They made $2 a week minus $1.25 for room and board because they lived in boarding houses surrounding the factory. You can see the buildings on the map. And the men made $3 to $4 a week minus the $1.75 for their room and board. So things haven't changed too much. The girls had 14-hour work days, 6 days a week. They would wake up at 4:30 a.m. with a bell. They had breakfast at 5. They would work at 5:30. They had a half-hour lunch break. Then they would work till 6:30 or 7, depending on the light and the time of the year, and then have supper. And then they would live in their boarding houses. And I apologize for the quality of some of these pictures. I've taken the pictures from maps that we have in the library, which are protected by Mylar. So when you try and take, like the map on the back wall, when you try and take a picture through Mylar, you get reflection no matter what you do. So they're not the best quality pictures. But if you want to see the real map, it's in the back room, and I can show it to you after. So the Dover Cotton Factory soon employed 300 people. They built regular dwelling houses, lots of boarding houses. They bought 93 more acres up there, and they so liked their boss, John Williams, that they named their little village Williamsville. This is from an 1834 map, and you can see at the top where Williamsville is. The factory was profitable, the workers were happy, the investors were making money. There was really no high-grade work until an Irishman named John Burns arrived from Ireland and really got them into making good quality muslin cloth. There was curiosity and speculation all over New England, particularly northern New England, where there had never been a factory before. This little #1 factory had to whitewash their windows because of industrial spying, because people were coming from all over New England to peer in the windows to see what were they doing and how were they doing it and what's running this machinery. So it was really like the Microsoft of their day, where everybody was trying to steal trade secrets. In 1819, the guy who owned the land down where the mills are now, Daniel Waldron, went bankrupt. So Williams and Wendell purchased 81 acres at the first falls of the Cacciucco, which is the one right under the bridge, right on our main drag there, and to expand. But they needed more money. All the local investors had given everything they could, and there was no more money in Dover. Dover was not a rich town. So they started taking trips to Boston looking for investors. They were very successful, but they were also very naive. William Payne, P-A-Y-N-E, became president of the Dover Cotton Factory because he was the largest investor, and it was to him that the bank conveyed the downtown property in 1821. These are, if you know where the Noggin Factory is and the 7th Settlement Restaurant, this is right in between them. This was just taken this summer. These are all the cornerstones from the mills when they were constructed. And they were taken from different parts of the building, and during the renovations in the 1880s, put all in one place. You can see all the different names, and the earliest one being the Dover Cotton Factory here, kind of hidden by this railing. Then Dover Manufacturing, then Cacciucco, then Pacific. Well, we'll go through all that. But they laid the cornerstone for the new mill, which they called Mill Number 2, on July 4th, 1821. And they raised their investment capital stock to $500,000, which was 10 times the original. The upper factory continued to work, but the operations moved downtown gradually. By 1828, most of the Williamsville buildings were moved, physically removed, and moved to downtown. They didn't tear down buildings in those days. They loaded them on a cart and they hauled them down and they reused them. The upper factory was used sparingly until 1848, when it was raised to make way for a railroad route. So this is an actual picture of Dover, an etching. In 1820, before the mills really got going, our population was about 2,800. By 1830, the population had doubled to almost 5,600. So if you imagine that, we went up 100% in 10 years. It was the most tumultuous decade of growth in Dover's history. We talk about growth nowadays. Can you imagine we're at 30,000, that if all of a sudden in 2027 we were at 60,000? This is what it was like for Dover during that early time. The huge brick factories that were built downtown on our river changed the skyline, and they altered the social, economic, and even religious climate of the town. By 1822, they had completed mill number 2, 4 stories high. Now, in building these great gargantuan brick buildings, and by the way, all the bricks were made in Dover, which also contributed to the economic climate because there were brickyards all along the Bellamy River and some also on the Cacciucco River. And you can still see bricks at low tide if you're out on the river. So that started a little cottage industry of brick making. We needed builders, we needed masons. The bricklayers were doing 60,000 bricks a day, so dozens of them, hundreds of them were employed in building these buildings. Then the craftsmen, the tradesmen, everybody who was moving to Dover, they demanded more shops, more consumer goods, which then added to downtown. So you can see the whole town just really flourished with this. They wanted more entertainment venues. They wanted different church denominations. In the early history of Dover, you had the Quakers and the First Parish Congregational, and that was it. By the end of the 1830s, there were 13 different denominations in Dover, each with their own church. Now, mill number 2 had a wooden platform where the Gundel Os would come up the river to unload the cotton bales from the larger vessels. The large vessels couldn't get up all the way to Dover because the river was shallow and it was too narrow for them to come up. So through a process called lightering, the Gundel Os would go out to the bigger ships, unload the cotton bales, bring it up to the dock at mill number 2. The cotton would be turned into cloth. The cloth would be put back on the Gundel Os, shipped out to the bigger ship, and shipped wherever it happened to be going. So the Gundel O, which is a unique vessel, unique to this region of the Piscataqua region, is called the workhorse of the tidal basin. And that's a whole other talk unto itself if you talk about the Gundel O. The reproduction Gundel O was in Dover the first week in October. And did anybody get a chance to ride on it? They did 3 sails from Dover. It was fabulous. It was like being on the old, and seeing the river from the Gundel O is just great. So my hope is that someday when we have a developed waterfront and a real dock, that we can have the Gundel O come up and do regular trips from our city. So the building continued. Mill number 3 was built in 1823. That was 5 stories high. Also in 1823, they changed the name of the company to the Dover Manufacturing Company, from the Dover Cotton Factory to the Dover Manufacturing Company, because now we were a bigger deal. They kept going, Williams and Wendell kept going to Boston to raise more money. So by 1823, their capital was $1 million. Isaac Wendell left to start a Great Falls Manufacturing Company in Somersworth, so he was gone from the company, which left John Williams in charge. In 1825, they built mill number 4, which was 6 stories high, an L-shaped mill. An L-shaped construction architecture had never been done before, so that was another reason Dover was prominent, because everybody wanted to know how you build a mill with a bend in it. Also, they're very innovative, they put in skylights so that the girls could work longer by the natural light of day. Truly innovative in their ideas. Number 5 and number 6 completed the quadrangle, which was the leather belting operation that was set up in number 5, and which is now the parking lot for the bank. This is number 5, and then this is now TD Bank, so that's number 6. Those were the main offices. And the leather belts were needed to run the looms, and if you go in the mills now, you can see an example of one, and they are, 3-4 feet wide and 2 or 3 inches thick, and that ran up and down through the floors running the mills and the looms. So that's why we had the leather belting company start in Dover, which turned into its own operation, which turned into the tannery. And some of you have been in here in Dover for a long time, remember the tannery that was on Orchard Street. And that all came from the setup of the mills. Their next problem was they were running out of people to work in the mills. They had to produce more and more cloth and ship it further and further afield, but there weren't enough girls. So they put an ad in the paper, the Dover Cotton Factory. They want 50 smart, capable girls between 12 and 25 years of age to work in the factory, to whom constant employ and good encouragement will be given. None need apply unless they come well recommended. In addition, we will also hire families, as long as they have a large number of girls. Also, and we'll find work for the girls to do, and we'll also employ the parents somehow. So if a whole family wants to come, and any person, again, must bring undoubted recommendations of their own character. So morality was very, very important to work in the mills. It was a character operation, and employees were expected to toe the line. This is from August 1822, so this is just between mill number 2 and mill number 3 being built. There were good wages, and the 1830 city directory lists 112 boarding houses in Dover. Families could rent a house that the company built for $75 a year or $90 with a basement. The company owned all the housing on Payne Street, which is now named for William Payne, the president, but it's now called Henry Law Avenue, so all of that housing was owned by the company. And almost all the housing from 1st Street to 5th Street was also all company housing, tenement housing for the workers. John Williams was very paternal and benevolent and very fatherly, watching over the girls, making sure everything was good with them, that they would behave, that they were being treated correctly. And he proudly boasted that there has never been a case of bastardy at Dover. I don't know if you can read all this. It's not important that you do. These are the boarding house rules. And they stressed polite language, stressed cooperation, decorum. Very respectable job. The workers who came to Dover to work in the mills were driven here, attracted by the advantages of working in the mills, not really driven here by force of financial circumstances. It was the first profession in which women could achieve some degree of financial independence. The mill work offered a great degree of sociability. When the girls couldn't go away to college, because of course girls didn't go to college at that time, this was like living in a dorm when you lived in a boarding house. You had rules, you had a house mother, you had a job, you had friends, you did things together. There were leisure and social activities. There were opportunities for further education. It was an honorable way to earn a dowry. It was a dignified way to be self-supporting. These are the rules for working in the Dover Manufacturing Company's establishment. Again, pretty simple, stressing decorum and responsibility, not real lengthy. They had a 10 p.m. curfew. There was no card playing or gambling while at work. There was no intemperate drinking, not no drinking, but no intemperate drinking. No profane or improper language. They must join a church of their choice. And that's why we had all the denominations came in and why we have so many churches. And they must contribute 2 cents a week to John Williams' health care fund, which was insurance of the time, kind of the forerunner of Obamacare. Now, that's not to say that conditions weren't hazardous or the hours weren't long. There were head and eye injuries. There's tales of girls who didn't keep their hair up, got caught in the machinery and got scalped. Flying shuttles and parts flying off the looms would give eye and ear injuries, head injuries. There was really insufficient light, a deafening noise with all the machinery going. The interior was very stuffy and lint-filled, and girls often suffered from respiratory and lung diseases. Still, when they went on vacation and they went home to the farm, more likely than not, they brought their friends back with them to Dover, to the factory, so that they too could be employed. Girls usually stayed working for 2 to 4 years, most of them leaving usually to get married. Again, one of those shiny pictures that was taken through Mylar, so it's not the best quality. John Williams, a quote from him, it said, "It is also requested that each one should keep a watchful eye over her own conduct when out of the factory, that all may acquire and retain the respect and regard of the community." Very, very paternalistic, very concerned that his girls and his employees show the regular residents of Dover that they were of good moral character and in good standing in the community. And that's our Central Avenue Bridge right there. Here's another picture from that same map where I got that picture, you can see that the mills were constructed with pitched roofs, and then that little row of skylights or clerestory windows that let as much light into the mill as possible so we could keep the girls working at least till sunset. Now these are maps that somebody gave us this summer and said, if you don't want them, I'll just throw them away. And I'm like, oh, these are wonderful. These are maps of Ayers Pond, Bow Lake, and Nippo. And Cacciucco Manufacturing Company, Dover Manufacturing Company agents at the time went out and bought land rights and water rights around these 3 ponds because they fed the Cacciucco River. And by controlling the water rights, they could control the flow of the river, which could control the water power, which would, they could make it go faster if we needed more power, or they could hold the dam back if there was a flood and too much water. They did it sort of surreptitiously. They didn't say it was the Dover Manufacturing Company that was buying up these water rights. And they said that if the people who had sold all this land and control of the water at these 3 ponds had known that it was the Dover Manufacturing Company, the prices would have been much higher. I'm kind of reminded that's what I heard happened at Disneyland when Walt Disney went down to Florida, and he, using fake names or fake people, bought up all the land that's now Walt Disney World in Florida, but they got it really cheap because nobody knew it was really Disney. Same kind of thing happened. So we're controlling the river, we're controlling the flow of the water, it's all coming down to Dover. In 1826, John Williams traveled to England because, again, he's always thinking ahead. He went to Sir Robert Peel's factories in Manchester, investigating calico printing. Up to this point, we had just been doing plain white muslin cloth, very good quality, shipping it out. He wanted to print patterns or colors on the cloth. So he persuaded 5 English printers and engravers to immigrate to Dover, and they came back with him, and he set them up in houses on 5th Street. He also purchased some machinery, and they were doing block printing only at this time. In 1827, he set up 16 printing machines in mill number 5 and was able to print 70,000 yards of cotton a week. What's a picture of cows doing in the middle of this presentation? Well, as it turns out, in order to get the printed colors on the cloth to be bright and clear and set properly, all of the printed cloth had to be run through what they called a dung bath, which would set the colors and remove the excess mordant from the cloth. Now, dung bath, the main ingredient, is manure. And where do you get manure? But from cows. So the company bought a herd of cows and set them up, and they collected 30,000 bushels of cow manure annually to use to print the cloth, to make it bright and clear and pretty. So they couldn't care less about the milk. It was given away for free to the employees. And this herd resided on the street that we now call Milk Street. And that's where that got its name. I like this picture because it looks so like Garrison Hill looks like it's the White Mountains. And it's a very artistic, impressionistic look at what Dover looked like. I do believe that's Garrison Hill over on the right. But it's just, I really like the picture. It's just really interesting in the artist's portrayal of it. So this is about 1827, and John Williams was in the New Hampshire legislature at this point, and his Boston investors asked him to sponsor a bill creating a separate company called the Cacciucco Manufacturing Company. The owners would be the Boston men. Williams thought this was just for the printery operations, the new printery, but he was pretty naive. So the bill was passed in the legislature in 1827, and we formed the Cacciucco Manufacturing Company. So Dover Manufacturing, Cacciucco Manufacturing, it coexisted for 2 years. So, however, we had always spelled Cacciucco with a second H right here. But when they went to register the company in the Secretary of State's office in Concord, the secretary or the clerk or whoever was doing the recording spelled the name wrong. So they officially became known as Cacciucco with one H Manufacturing Company. So that's why in Dover, you'll see it both ways. The river, we still say Cacciucco with two H's. We have Cacciucco Country Club with two H's. But anything to do with the mills, you should do one H. So if I'm doing something or writing something or sending something out, my spell check always finds one and say, no, it's not the same as the other. And I'm like, that's right, it's two different things. So our streets are Cacciucco Street with a CHO, if you look. They're both really correct, but when you're talking about the manufacturing company, you really use this spelling. So the two companies existed for 2 years, and then through a sort of sneaky plan by the Boston investors, they eased out the Dover Manufacturing Company and John Williams. They bought 25% of the shares of the Dover Manufacturing Company and paid off in notes of the Cacciucco Manufacturing Company. The annual meeting of the company, which was always held in Dover up to this point, was moved to Boston, so nobody from Dover could attend. They siphoned off all the assets of the Dover Manufacturing Company, and the Dover Manufacturing Company's stock became worthless. They went bankrupt, and the Boston investors bought it at auction for $1 over debts. Then they fired John Williams, and he eventually moved to Boston and died there, bereft in 1843. His obituary said that he was a close student of the University of Experience, and not a reader of books, but could read men like a book, which I don't think is true because he certainly didn't read those Boston investors, so he was out. So the Boston group put in another Boston guy in charge of the Cacciucco Manufacturing Company, as it's now called, and his name was James Curtis. And he was had been a midshipman on the USS Constitution during the War of 1812. He was a very harsh taskmaster. He was only after bottom line profit. The girls, he didn't care about them. Their well-being didn't matter. He lowered their wages from 58 cents a day to 53 cents a day. He raised their quotas, and he increased their loom speeds. He was called nothing but a grinding toil, man-driving, man-breaking supervisor. He had a, quote, large stock of pluck that he had acquired in the Navy, and he used spies and guards in the factories to try and catch people doing the wrong thing. So, he also changed the rules. Before, quiet talking was okay. Now talking was forbidden inside the factory. If you were late, a 12.5-cent lateness fee was imposed, which is a pretty good portion of your day's wage. And joining a combination, which is what they called a union at the time, was cause for dismissal. So the girls got pretty sick of James Curtis after they'd had the benevolent John Williams for all these years. James Curtis, they'd had it. So on December 30th, 1828, about 600 of the 800 girls turned out of the factory. And they paraded around the quad with banners and signs and martial music and speeches. The Dover Inquirer reported the next day, a general turnout of the girls employed in the factories took place in this town in the number of 600 or 800, all because of imaginary grievances. And it goes on for a little bit, and it says that they will without doubt return in the next few days. The last sentence, the whole presented one of the most disgusting scenes we have ever witnessed. So they put an ad in the paper advertising for girls to replace the girls who had walked out. So 3 days later, the original girls went back to work, no better off. But this is really important, December 30th, 1828, because Dover was the site of the first strike by women in the United States. Yay! It's said that the huge number of boarding houses in Dover fomented this revolutionary spirit, because everybody would get together and chat each other up, and they got all this in this fervor, and they were going to go out and do it. But it was really more just a picturesque demonstration without any real purpose or any real organization behind it. But we are very proud to be the site of the first strike by women. So they're back to work, no better off than they were before. In 1834, there was another strike, and James Curtis resigned. He'd had it. He went and took a job in Boston, and the company was taken over by Moses Paul, John Williams' nephew, who was, again, in the same benevolent mode as his uncle had been. In 1839, James Curtis, as I've said, he was a very brusque, task-oriented man, and no frivolity or anything. He was taking a train into Boston. He was late for a meeting, and he pulled out his stopwatch and saw that the train was arriving late. And he felt the train slow down, so he stuck his head outside the train window to see if they were pulling into the station, and a pole along the track decapitated him. So it said that when the word got back to Dover, a big cheer went up in the factory that James Curtis was gone. So Moses Paul, who looks like this gruff, awful man, was really great. And he stayed, he had run the upper factory at Williamsville for his uncle. And then after James Curtis was gone, they brought Moses Paul back in to settle things down. The Cacciucco Manufacturing Company prospered, was solvent. They solved all their labor issues with the workers. They became highly productive. They were innovative. And Moses Paul served 30 years as the agent until his death in 1860. Now, during his tenure, lots of important things were happening in the mills. They switched from wood fires to coal, and they built a big coal pocket. This is coal. And we are kind of, from our perspective, we're kind of standing at the liquor store right here, looking down First Street. And that along here is a little coal trestle. They had little cars. So the train, which came in 1842, which is right up here on 3rd Street, right where the station is now, would deliver coal, and they would fill up this coal pocket, and the trestles would bring it to the mills. So instead of burning wood, they were burning coal, and that was due to Moses Paul. In the 1850s, he upgraded all the machinery, and they changed from block printing to cylinder printing in terms of the printing operations. Later on, during the renovations in the mills, after Moses Paul's tenure, they replaced the big overshot water wheels, which had been used to catch the water from the falls and create water power, were replaced with turbines. There we go. So this picture, which is hard to distinguish, is Henry Law Park. So if you look up here, there's City Hall. Actually, then it was the City Hall and Opera House. So Central Avenue is right back here, and this would probably be the Washington Street Bridge over here. And this is now the walkway around Henry Law Park, where that little bandstand is, and this is all green grass. So calico printing, now that we're doing it with cylinders, required huge, big, massive printing operations. So they couldn't do it in Little Mill Number 5 anymore. So between 1842 and 1844, they built about a dozen big buildings in what's now Henry Law Park and created Cacciucco Printworks. It employed 400 men and 40 women because of the heavy-duty nature of the work and the need to lift these big cylinders and move them. Whereas at the calico mills, it was the reverse. It was 2/3 women and 1/3 men. Here it was pretty much 90% men and 10% women. Very successful. So the printing operations expanded, and we're doing much more difficult printing and much more intricate patterns. But if we go back now, and I know you can't read any of this, but if you remember the slide that showed you the employment rules back in the 1820s, these are the employment rules in the 1850s. A lot more complicated and a lot more structure and regulation. They were less polite, they were more adamant, they were less kind in the way they were phrased. They had things about the economical use of supplies, the proper care of machinery, the quantity of waste that you made was measured. There was a regulation against no hallooing out the open windows. Hello! Can do that. No spirituous liquor, no smoking, and no frictious matches. I like that because I didn't know a match could be non-frictious, I guess. There should be no children allowed in the factories unless they're working. They have to give 2 weeks' notice. They have to sign regulation papers that you agree to follow all these rules. There's no reading on the job. They could throw no waste in the river. So the boarding house system was disappearing because, as you know, in the late 1840s, Ireland had a huge famine, potato famine, and many, many people emigrated to Dover and started working in our factories. A couple of years later, this is the timetable of the Cacciucco mills. Again, depending on the time of year, when they got up, when they had a lunch break, when they went to work. The Irish immigrants took over from the farm girls. No more farm girls were coming. The dignity of mill employment had slowly declined. So there was no urge to come and work in the factories. They abandoned those jobs to those who they thought had a lower standard of living, i.e. the Irish, and who would accept lower wages. So the whole character of the factory changed by the 1850s. The employers, however, were really happy to see a new source of labor, one that they didn't have to respect or treat very well. There was no moral burden to improve their lives, and they had no standing in the community anyway. In the 1840s to the 1860s, wages rose just 2%, yet production per worker went up 26%. By 1860, 75% of all cotton cloth was made in New England, because by now we were not unique, and there were factories, of course, you know about Lowell and Lawrence and Rhode Island and all the places that were also manufacturing cloth. So the next agent was Zimri Wallingford, who served 26 years until his death in 1886. And then after him was John Holland, who I couldn't find a picture of, just an etching in the newspaper, who served until 1895. And these two gentlemen ran the Cacciucco Manufacturing Company during its greatest period of production and its greatest expansion in the mill's history. In 1877, they opened new mill number 1. I always think it's interesting. We had the first mill up, on Kimball's Falls. Then we built number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5, number 6. So when you think they build this one, it would be number 7. No, they called it new number 1. So this is a picture of it today. It's now called One Washington Center. And there's a postcard from when it was around the time that it was first built. It was 400 by 74 feet with a 165-foot by 74-foot wing. And it was built on a section of Dover that they called the beach. And this was the shipbuilding area where lots of ships were launched back before there were factories. It had 2,600 looms and 100,000 spindles, and it opened in 1877. So these are the glory days of the Cacciucco Manufacturing Company. And this is undated, but I gauge it to be around 1878, 1879. And the reason is because the new factory is here. There's new number 1. The old factory has not had its renovations yet. It still has the pitched roofs, and you can see gaps between the building, which I'll explain that they fixed that. And here's all the printery operations. So this is now our Henry Law Park. And you can see the trestle that goes across. And if you go down to Henry Law Park, you'll still see this cement foundation in the river, and that's where the trestle used to go across. And this was Payne Street, later called Henry Law Avenue. So this was the mills in all of their glory about 1878. Remember that gap that you see there. So during the 1880s, they did extensive renovations. In fact, if you go downtown today and you look at our mills, they say 1880 and 1881. Those were when the renovations were done. So the brick structures are still the original from the 1820s, but they took off, now that we had this thing called electricity in Dover, they took off the pitched roofs at the top of each mill, and they raised them up and added another story to the mill, so there was no more working space. So this is them renovating. And they put in the electricity, and they constructed 2 immense chimneys, one of which still exists today, which I'm so happy is there because I think it's kind of a symbol of Dover's heritage. And they joined all of the buildings together. I mean, I showed you those gap. That was always inefficient because if you were on the 4th floor of mill number 4 and you had to go to the 2nd floor of mill number 3, you'd have to go down, 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 across, 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 up, up, up. So they joined them all to form one continuous building, 732 feet long, so that it made the whole operation more efficient. They still called them mill 2, 3, and 4, but they were all joined together. That was another thing that happened in the 1880s. So by then they had 140,000 spindles, 2,800 looms, 1,200 employees, and 26 boilers in a steam heating plant. And that steam heating plant is now the parking lot where the chimney is, right across from Fury's restaurant, where if you park in there you get a ticket because you're not a tenant, which I did once. So these are some stereopticon views of all the mill machinery in place, and you can just see thousands and thousands of pieces of equipment and yard upon yard of all kinds of carding machines and milling machines and weaving machines. Not a real pleasant place to work. It was where each new wave of immigrants went to work when they started out in Dover. Business was very steady in making the cotton cloth. On the mill 2, 3, 4 side of the river, but on the other side at the Cacciucco Printworks, it was positively booming. They had incredible designers who came up with 10,000 different patterns of cloth, and all of these are not in Dover. These are a few that are at the Woodman Museum that you can go and see, but most of them are at the American Textile History Museum in Lowell. They have the complete collection of the Cacciucco fabrics. Gorgeous to see, and they were worldwide known. Everybody, if you Google Cacciucco prints, you'll see all kinds of quilt companies now that sell reproductions of Cacciucco fabrics for people who do a lot of quilting. One company had a Cacciucco quilt contest using just reproduction fabrics of the fabrics that were made in the Cacciucco mills. You had to create a quilt and make it out of those fabrics. You can still buy that today. So they were known for their originality of design and the quality of their work, and they shipped worldwide. They were also known for their ability to fake materials. It was still just plain old cotton, but they could make it look like wool, like seersucker, like satin with a sheen on it, just by changing the color variation and the patterns. They could print up to 12 colors on one piece of cloth. Now it's interesting, this said that this is an 1888 print, and it took 478 hours to prepare this design for printing, from design to transfer to the print rollers. And if you think about it with cylinder printing, for this piece of cloth to print, they had to run it through and print just the pink on it. Then they had to run it through and print the red, and then the brown, and then the blue. And to have it come out so perfectly and not have the colors run into each other, I mean, it was an incredible feat, and the company was world-renowned for their ability to do this. They were producing in the 1880s 65 million yards of cloth per year and shipping it out. They had 30 acres of manufacturing space in Dover. Now, if you'd like to see more Cacciucco fabrics, the library has a Pinterest page called Cacciucco Mills Textiles. So the address is on the bottom there, so you can go to our Pinterest page and take a look at 100 or so samples of Cacciucco fabrics that we've gathered from here, there, and everywhere. The company boasted that, quote, "In years to come, the company will be gratefully remembered as one which labored with that degree of intelligence which lifted not only themselves, but scores of others to place and fame and comfortable circumstances in life, and provided employment and homes for thousands more." So now we're at the peak. So what happens after that? The downfall. It all started with Dover's Black Day, March 1st, 1896, when a huge flood, it was a late winter storm, rained for 3 days, and all of the ice that had accumulated on the banks of the Cacciucco River all 35, 40 miles of it, all the way up to New Durham. It all broke loose, and all these big ice flows and big icebergs, chunks, were coming down the Cacciucco River. And it hit Dover hard. It took out every bridge in town. It closed the factory for many days. It damaged lots and lots of businesses. And the factory recovered and reopened, but I always see this as the point in which the factory started its downturn. This is the Central Avenue Bridge. So this is aircraft right now. And here we are, here's the falls. So we're kind of looking from that walkway right in front of the mills. This would be the Falls restaurant over here. So you can see the bridge is gone. One of the granite piers from this bridge was found on a lawn in Newcastle the following day. That's how much Dover's Black Day hurt us. So the company tried to rebound, and they said, okay, we're going to build a velvet mill. It's going to be unique. There's not another one like it in the whole United States. And we're going to put it on the city farm near the, we're now in the blank spaces with the Waterfront Development Committee is working on putting something. And so Agent Charles Fish said that was his brilliant idea. We're going to build a velvet mill. So if the city will give us a break on the land and no taxes for 10 years, we'll make this a great success. So even though the mill's declining a little, the velvet mill is going to bring us back. He said it would bring in a large number of a better class of employee. It lasted from 1905 to 1912. It was sold by the Pacific Mills to Merrimack Manufacturing Company. So the velvet mill failed. We had the Black Day, the velvet mill failed. And then we had the big fire in New Mill number 1, 1 Washington Center. So we are at the top of Main Street here, looking down. This is Smiley's Plaza. So you're up here. Genados would be kind of right up here. So you're looking down that one-way street at the fire in the mill, which happened on January 26, 1907. Ironically, the fire started because of a faulty sprinkler system, which caused another problem, which caused friction, which caused 2 belts to rub together, which caused a spark, which caused the fire. They fought this fire for 3 days and 58 hours. It was below zero. We had poor firefighting equipment at the time, you know, horses and carts and hoses. You can see after the fire was over that the water from the carts and the hoses just froze to ice on the sides of the building. 4 lives were lost, and a 5th one was lost when another man later died of his injuries. And people were jumping from the windows. It was total chaos, and the mill, which had been built in 1877, burned down in 1907. However, it was rebuilt the next year and opened again, but again, it was another blow to the manufacturing company. So what about the workers at the time? Here's a picture of some Dover workers. So about the time of the fire, the Irish had begun to move out and find other things to do, and they were replaced by the next wave of immigrants, which were the French Canadians. The French Canadians were soon replaced by the Greeks and the Armenians. So if you talk to people who are native Dover and have been here for a couple generations, almost everybody is either Irish, French, or Greek, or some combination of the above. And that's because everybody's family came to work in the mills. So at this time, the population in the mill was French Canadian 49%, Irish 13%, Greek 10%, and 20% of the people just called themselves Americans. In 1909, the Cacciucco Manufacturing Company was purchased by the Pacific Mills of Lawrence, Massachusetts, and we changed names again. We became known as the Cacciucco Division of the Pacific Mills. In 1909, a very famous documentary photographer named Louis Hine came to Dover because he was very interested in child labor and working on legislation that would stop young kids from working in factories and in industry. And he was very instrumental in changing child labor laws in the US. So he found that between 1880 and 1900, children ages 5 to 10 who worked for wages went up over 50%. So more and more kids were working. 1 in 6 children were employed in factories. He helped form the National Child Labor Committee, and he came to Dover on May 17, 1909, and took these pictures at our factories of boys underage who were working in our mills. So there's one set, and then here's another. I love the one with the girls. They were all, everybody looks happy. Unfortunately, a lot of those little young boys are smoking, but that helped pass the case for child labor laws. In 1938, we passed the Fair Labor Standards Act, which says that no interstate commerce of goods produced by children under the age of 16 could be traded. But you can, pick out, that's right at 1 Washington Center, right at the gate there. It's the same gate, it's the same entrance. It's amazing to see that. So now we're in 1911, and this is another drawing that's under glass, so I apologize for the glare up there. This was an architectural drawing which labels. It's been very helpful to researchers, because, and it's in the next room if anybody wants to see it. Each building is labeled, so it'll tell you what was done and what was made in each of those buildings. So again, this is the printery operations, Henry Law Park. Here's the rebuilt, after the fire, new mill number 1. And here's the all connected one building, factory 2, 3, and 4. And there's the 2 chimneys, of which we have 1 left. And here's the steam heating plant that's now a parking lot. By 1913, the printery operations were done, and the whole operation moved to Lawrence, Massachusetts, and all these buildings were torn down. I heard this summer that, they're building a new playground at Henry Law Park with the Gundel O in it. The old Gundel O is part of the, and they had plans to build structures out of granite. They didn't have to buy any granite, because when they dug up for the park, for the playground, they found enough granite from these buildings to structure the new playground. So when your kids or grandkids go play in that playground, they could be playing on granite that's from the Cacciucco Printworks from 100 and something years ago. I think it's very cool. So the printery was gone. In 1916, they were only producing 35 million yards of cotton cloth a year. So that's down from 65 to 35. Production continued to diminish every year, but they did have a brief upturn during World War I, making uniforms and blankets. This is a 1920s postcard. It's a little fuzzy. This is during the Depression. Just a nice scene taken from the top of the Masonic Temple building. So this is, Central Square, Washington Street, intersecting with Central Avenue. This is the Foster's building. They still have 2 chimneys, and then the big quadrangle still existing. But again, production was slowing. All operations at Pacific Mills, at the Cacciucco division of the Pacific Mills, ceased in 1937. The mills closed. This was mostly due not only to the Depression, but also to Southern competition. Folks in the South realized that why are we shipping all this raw cotton to the North? Why don't we just build factories here and make our own cotton cloth? So that's what they did. This just turned up this summer, too. The same person who gave us the maps of the 3 ponds found this and said, I don't know if you want this. I was going to throw it away. I'm like, yes. So this was the actual flyer of the auction that was held by Pacific Mills to get rid of the buildings in Dover. And it happened in 1941. And, there's all the marketing. It's wonderful, and 500,000 square feet of space, and this and this and this. It's going to happen in Boston, 17 parcels, on and on and on. Sounds great. No one bid except the city of Dover. The city bid $54,000 and won. So all of a sudden, the city owned all of this property and the buildings. In the 1940s and 50s, the city leased it out to companies. We had Eastern Air Devices, Miller Shoe, and, of course, Claristat. Until recently, we still called the 1 Washington Center building Claristat. Some people still call it Claristat. The mills were in serious disrepair. no one was taking care of them. These companies who leased the space took care of their own space but didn't care about the actual structure of the building. So in the 50s and 60s, the buildings were in serious disrepair. And we hadn't done urban renewal yet. We had a big tannery across the street. And of course, tanning leather has not got a great odor to it. And that's when it became known as Portsmouth by the Sea and Dover by the Smell. And everybody who was Irish and French and Greek, whose parents had or grandparents had come here, and this is how they ended up in Dover, everybody was kind of embarrassed when they looked at these mills, and people wanted to tear them down. And you'd kind of look at it and you'd go, yeah, my grandfather worked there. You're kind of ashamed because, you know, that's where they had to work. It was an eyesore until 1984, when the mills were bought by two gentlemen named Tim Pearson and Joe Sawtelle. They sandblasted the entire structure. They replaced almost 900 windows. They made the courtyard, the Cacciucco courtyard, where we have concerts and art fairs and all kinds of stuff today. It's where the Santa's house just went up this weekend. They put new copper flashing and trim on the building. They built new entryways, and they had turned a lot into great office spaces for lease or rent. Does anybody remember who the first tenant was in the mills after they were renovated?
Liberty Mutual.
Liberty Mutual was the first tenant. And they just took part of a floor, and they just had a small operation. And then they took more room, and then they took more room, and then they outgrew that space. And they said, you know, we really like Dover. We're going to build here. So now we have, I don't know, there are 2 or 3 buildings up there with over 2,000 people. And that's because the mills attracted them to come to Dover. So, you know, it's building on kind of the old traditions. All of a sudden, the mills started looking good, and everybody was happy. And if you were Irish or French or Greek, all of a sudden you'd say, my grandfather worked in that mill, and you were happy about it. Well, all of a sudden we had a new pride in what our heritage was. And then when the city bought these at auction, there was talk of we should just tear them all down and do something else with the land. But the city council at the time said, no, you know, there's a heritage there, there's a tradition, we should keep these and see what they can turn into for the future. And what a great foresight I think that was for that city council at that time. So Claristat has now become One Washington Center, which is a place for food vendors and restaurants, and there's all kinds of artist studios. There's so much going on at One Washington Center. And this is a picture from the Cacciucco Mills, which are now being turned into residences on the upper floors. Chinberg Properties bought the mills, and there are now 100 plus apartments. And then the commercial properties are at the One Washington Center building for artists. And retail and residential studios, 2 lofts, to one and 2 bedrooms. And the rent starts, I think, at $1,000 and goes up into the 2,000s. And they have a waiting list, and every apartment that they finish is rented. And there are people there who live up in one floor and then work down on the bottom floor. They don't even need to have a car. They can shop at Genados Market across the street. They can eat and drink downtown. It's created a new urban vibrancy in Dover. So now we're really happy about our mills. And interesting that we've come full circle from not having them to loving them to hating them to all of a sudden re-embracing them. So I'm really happy to see you all here tonight. I'd be happy to take any comments or questions. There's tons of stuff that I don't know that if you have any information you can add, I'd be happy to have it. But I did want to add one thing. About 10 years ago, the Dover Historical Society went out of business. And I sense from everybody I talked to that there's a real interest in Dover history from a lot of people. And seeing you all turn out tonight kind of reinforces that for me. So, I mean, I'm not offering to start it up again, but I think if anybody is interested in sort of reinvigorating and restarting up a Dover Historical Society, there's a whole lot of people who I think would be happy to join you. So thank you very much, and I'll be happy to hear anything you have to say.